I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular episode is one of a group on John Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost. And here I'll be saying some things about Book 4, in which the reader first meets Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Milton begins Book 4 by interrupting his narrative for an apostrophe. The apostrophe is a conventional element of the epic in which the poet interrupts his narrative to call on the gods to intervene. Someone like St. John the Divine in the book of Revelations, who could have foretold what would happen, who could have warned Adam and Eve of the trouble that was about to befall them. I'll read a few lines from the beginning of Book 4, in which Satan reveals his true character, his inner thoughts, as he prepares his assault on Adam and Eve. As he enters the new creation, he sees the newly created sun, and he pauses to curse its brilliance. O thou, he says, O thou that with surpassing glory crowned look'st from thy sole dominion like the God of this new world, at whose sight all the stars hide their diminished heads. To thee I call, but with no friendly voice, and add thy name, O sun, to tell thee how I hate thy beams, that bring to my remembrance from what state I fell, how glorious once above thy sphere, till pride and worse ambition threw me down, warring in heaven against heaven's matchless king. Oh, had his powerful destiny ordained me some inferior angel, I had stood then happy. No unbounded hope had raised ambition. Yet why not? Some other power as great might have aspired, and me, though mean, drawn to his part. But other powers as great fell not, but stand unshaken, from within or from without, to all temptations armed. Hadst thou the same free will and power to stand? Thou hadst. Whom hast thou then, or what, to accuse, but heaven's free love dealt equally to all? Be then his love accursed, since love or hate to me alike it deals eternal woe. Nay, cursed be thou, since against his thy will chose freely what it now so justly rues. Me miserable, which way shall I fly? Infinite wrath and infinite despair. Which way I fly is hell, myself am hell, and in the lowest deep a lower deep still threatening to devour me opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. You remember I showed you that brief video of the medieval morality play Mankind with the comical devil or demon who speaks directly to the audience. This is a stock character, this devil from the medieval morality play, and also Milton is drawing on that dramatic tradition in these lines. So farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear, farewell remorse. All good to me is lost. Evil, be thou my good. Satan is the exact opposite. The more brave he is, the more courageous he is, the more heroic he is, the more evil he is, because all of his efforts are directed against God. If he were to repent briefly, he says, it would be temporary. Then he knows that he couldn't sustain it, and his next fall would be even deeper. So he's not even going to try to repent. So there's the apostrophe calling out for aid, a warning voice. Then Satan approaches paradise to find Adam and Eve, and when he first sees them, he expresses some psychological conflict. Maybe that's unexpected, that even Satan has this much tenderness and sympathy when he sees these beautiful creatures, and he realizes how he's going to destroy them, to what ruin he's going to bring them, and how terrible it will be. But it doesn't last long. And so he enters and surveys the Garden of Eden. He disguises himself in the shapes of different animals. And critics will point out that Milton is now showing us Satan in a descending order of magnificence or prominence or being. First, he is a fallen angel, and he's, of course, the most magnificent of all the fallen demon angels, but then he has to disguise himself as a cherub, as a low-level angel, in order to get past Uriel, to get to the Garden of Eden. And then when he gets to the Garden of Eden, he doesn't approach as he is, as the prince of demons, as Lucifer. He approaches by disguising himself first as one animal and then as another animal, from lions to tigers and eventually to a toad, and in book 9 as a serpent. So he overhears Adam and Eve talking, and it just happens that Adam is describing his love for Eve, and Eve is describing her first moments of consciousness when she first met Adam and what she felt and experienced. Then Adam and Eve will go to sleep in the evening, and the angel Ithuriel will discover Satan disguised as a toad in the garden. He discovers Satan at Eve's ear, whispering to her while she's asleep. Now, that doesn't sound quite fair for him to come whispering in her ear while she's asleep, but he does. And Ithuriel and Gabriel and other angels confront Satan. They exchange insults, and before they have a fight, Satan leaves, so Adam and Eve are saved for the moment. But then, if we skip over to book 5 opens with Adam and Eve waking up, and Adam has slept peacefully and well, but Eve appears to have been restless during the night. And she tells Adam that she's had a bad dream. She's had a kind of a nightmare. She explains that she had this dream in which she hears a voice and she follows it to the tree of knowledge, the forbidden tree. And there, a creature who looks like an angel takes a fruit from the tree and eats it. And the angel tells Eve that she could be like the gods if she ate this. But before she can try it, he vanishes and she returns to sleep. Adam is disturbed also when he hears this story, but he assures her or reassures her that having a nightmare is not necessarily the same thing as committing a sin. Dreaming about eating this forbidden fruit is not the same thing as doing it. And it's not necessarily a prediction of what will happen in the future, because she still has the faculty of reason, he says, to control her actions. So that comforts her, and they return to their activity. And their activity every day is gardening. They take care of the garden. Any questions about all of that? I'll just say, you might reasonably have the question, how could you have a nightmare in the Garden of Eden, in a place that's perfect? In order to have a nightmare, it would presume that there has to be an experience of evil in order to have something in your unconscious to drag up the frightening dream. And Milton doesn't have really quite an answer for this. His answer is simply that, well, Satan is whispering in her ear, and that's where the nightmare seems to come from. But then you have to ask, why wasn't she better guarded? She's minding her own business. She's just gone to sleep. She hasn't done anything. And somehow Satan gets into the garden and goes whispering into her ear. Not a good deal for Eve. And we'll come back to that. Interestingly, and I think significantly, Milton first introduces us, the readers, to Adam and Eve through the eyes of Satan. And I'll read a few lines from that section. A whole day's journey high but wide remote from this Assyrian garden, where the fiend saw undelighted all delight, all kind of living creatures new to sight and strange. Two of far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad in naked majesty, seemed lords of all, and worthy seemed, for in their looks divine the image of their glorious Maker shone. A whole day's journey, high but wide remote from this Assyrian garden, where the fiend saw undelighted all delight, all kind of living creatures, new to sight and strange, two of far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad in naked majesty, seemed lords of all, and worthy seemed, For in their looks divine the image of their glorious Maker shone. Truth, wisdom, sanctitude severe and pure, severe, but in true filial freedom placed, whence true authority in men, though both not equal, as their sex not equal seemed, for contemplation he, and valor formed, for softness she, and sweet attractive grace. He for God only, she for God in him. His fair large front and eyes sublime declared absolute rule, and hyacinthine locks round from his parted forelock manly hung, clustering, but not beneath his shoulders broad. She as a veil down to the slender waist her unadorned golden tresses wore, disheveled but in wanton ringlets waved as the vine curls her tendrils, which implied subjection, but required with gentle sway, and by her yielded, by him best received, yielded with coy submission, modest pride, and sweet reluctance, amorous delay. Nor those mysterious parts were then concealed. There was not guilty shame, dishonest shame of nature's works, honor dishonorable, sin bred. How have ye troubled all mankind with shows instead, mere shows of seeming pure, and banished from man's life his happiest life, simplicity and spotless innocence? So passed they naked on, nor shunned the sight of God or angel, for they thought no ill. So hand in hand they passed, the loveliest pair that ever since in love's embraces met. Adam, the goodliest man of men since born his sons, the fairest of her daughters, Eve. I hope you'll notice and agree with me that this is more than just a little bit sexist, as representation of the relationship between Adam and Eve. He was formed for contemplation and valor. She was formed for softness and sweet, attractive grace. He was formed for God only. She was formed for God in him. Adam has God. She has Adam. Adam is her God. Her access to God, her relationship to God is filtered through Adam. His fair large front and eyes sublime declared absolute rule, and his hyacinthine locks round from his parted forelock hung manly, clustering but not beneath his shoulders broad. She had longer hair down to the slender waist, and she wore it disheveled but in wanton ringlets it waved as the vine curls her tendrils, which implied subjection but required with gentle sway. In teaching literature, classical literature, one is always going to encounter sexist texts and representations. They're part of our history. They become part of our present as we continue to teach them and read them, make movies about them, talk about them, and hear about them in church, repeated and recovered for generation after generation. Where does these ideas come from? Where does Milton get the idea that Adam is formed for God and Eve is formed for Adam, and that Adam is for contemplation and valor formed, and Eve is formed for submission and softness and attractive grace? Where does he get that idea? And where do we get it? Probably from Genesis, where we have the description of the creation in one of the versions, Eve being formed from Adam's rib, and in another verse, Adam and Eve being created directly together simultaneously from the dust in God's image. Even there we have a contradictory representation of this creation. And also from Milton's contemporary society, which took this representation for granted and generally assumed that women were the weaker sex and men rightfully were dominant and preeminent. So they got it also, as we get it, from the Bible. So it's deeply inscribed in our cultural consciousness. In Genesis, as I said, there are two descriptions of the creation. And most people who think they know Genesis really know, filtered indirectly, the story as it's told in Milton and Paradise Lost. This narrative has become so familiar, it has been so popular over the centuries that it has sort of crowded out the biblical text just by familiarity over the centuries. How many of you have you heard the description in which Adam, then God puts him to sleep and pulls a rib from his side and creates Eve from the rib? A psychoanalytic reading of the creation narrative, that's the first one. That's the narrative in which Eve is created from Adam's rib, will suggest that Eve is being projected as a token of Adam's desire. Adam doesn't want a real creature, a companion who's just as smart as he is, just as strong as he is, has autonomy and individualism on her own account. Instead, he desires a token that's emblematic of himself, of his rib. She's created from his rib. She's always going to be necessarily less than he is because she is a part of him. And he's going to claim her as part of himself, as a kind of a statement of ownership. All that's pretty familiar, probably, and we've mentioned before the marriage ceremony custom of the father giving the bride to the groom to have in marriage, the woman, the token of owned property being passed from one man to another. If you continue analyzing it in terms of psychoanalytic theory, it seems that there's a kind of a homoerotic dimension to this Genesis creation story. What Adam really desires is not an entirely other creature, a woman who's equal but different. What he desires is a kind of a reflection of himself, represented by the bone and also by the flesh. Both those terms will be euphemisms for the male phallus or penis. So there's a kind of an underlying homoerotic structure to Adam's desire that's encoded in Genesis, and maybe it's inevitable in a kind of a power relation that one would desire something that can be controlled by oneself. So Eve, in this narrative, certainly for Milton, and arguably in the book of Genesis, has that kind of a possible dimension to her, just because of her subordination. So she yields gently but coyly. If she just said, okay, take me, that would not be so much fun for Adam. So Milton imagines that she'll play a little bit hard to get. And as she is viewing the image, she's entranced by the image of herself in the pool. Suddenly she hears a voice. One may think it's Adam's voice, but if you read closely, it doesn't seem to be Adam's voice. It may be the voice of an angel, it may be the voice of God, because the voice says, Eve, come away from there, fair creature. What you see there is not what you are made for. You're not made for yourself. Follow me, and I will bring thee to whom you are meant for. So she follows the voice, and it leads her to Adam. She sees Adam, and on first glance, he looks strong and handsome, appealing. Then he grabs her, he seizes her arm, and she feels his arm, and it's rough and hairy, and doesn't seem as beautiful as what she was looking at in the pool. And momentarily, she feels rejection for Adam, or I would say, for the heterosexual role that she is destined to play in this patriarchal order and tries to pull away. And Adam says, no, come with me. You're meant for me. She yields. Adam says, to give thee being, I lent out of my side to thee, nearest my heart, substantial life. To have thee by my side, henceforth an individual soul that's dear. Part of my soul I seek thee, and thee claim my other half. With that, thy gentle hand seized mine, I yielded, and from that time, see how beauty is excelled by manly grace and wisdom, which alone is truly fair. Manly grace and wisdom is the true beauty, not female charms, female grace, attractiveness. Well, that's Milton's view anyway. Now we can find all sorts of echoes of Genesis and especially of Paradise Lost in later literature and culture. I could go on and on. Of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Has anyone ever seen the Fritz Lang film Metropolis? You can still watch it. It's still quite watchable, from 1927, I think, which a mad scientist creates a robot, and it's a female robot. She's very attractive in a kind of a mechanical sort of way. So the Frankenstein narratives, anyone see a film just a few years ago called Ex Machina? Anyone see that one? A mad scientist has created a robot. It's kind of a Turing test to see if he can create a female robot that could convince another human that it was human. So it happens again and again. I'll show you one here that you might not have thought about, you've probably never seen. I want to show you a television commercial that, at least at one point, was the longest running television commercial in the history of American television. It's for Brut Cologne, and it began running during the World Series of 1987. Being a Cardinals fan, I was watching it, and I happened to be teaching Milton just at that time. And I said, wait a minute. This is right out of Book 4 of Paradise Lost. I'll play it and see if you see why I thought that.
For every man who wears Brut, there's a woman who loves what he smells like. Because there's something about Brut that's nice to be close to. And nobody knows that better than a woman. Brut. It smells like a man.
Hello? Honey, I was just thinking about you.
Brut. It smells like a man.
This woman, the commercial suggests that the woman gets her attractiveness and her value and her identity because she belongs to this man. He's off working, one presumes. She wakes up by herself. Some soft clarinet music plays. I hope you have the soft clarinet music when you wake up in the morning. And she goes over to put on something, to dress for the day, and something else catches her eye. It's not one of her blouses or dresses. Instead, it's one of his shirts. And she puts it on. Anything else? Why else? Why is that belittling? Yes.
Everything in it is just so gendered in like such a binary, concrete. Just, I don't know if that's jarring to very many people. I find it jarring personally.
Jarring.
When things are just gender attached to it.
Everyone hear that? The company, Brut, the chemical company that's making Brut Cologne, is selling, not the smell of the stuff, they're selling this girl. She looks great, but she might get boring if she's just lying around the house listening to clarinet music and dressing up in his clothes all day. You would want maybe better companionship at some point. So she goes over, picks up a shirt of his out of the closet, goes over to the mirror, buttons up the shirt, puts a tie on, looks in the mirror, then reaches over and grabs his hat, my hat right there, and puts it on. It's the piece de resistance, that hat is. Just the final touch. And she's looking in the mirror, just as Eve is looking in the mirror in Book 4 of Paradise Lost. She's pretty happy with herself, pretty satisfied with herself, pretty self-engaged, pretty self-involved. It's a narcissistic scene, like Narcissus before the pool, only this is a girl, but it's not exactly a woman, not exactly a woman as woman. It's a woman as little man. It's a woman as the property of her boyfriend or husband who must be off working. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, if that weren't bad enough, that her life is reduced to this bedroom and this clarinet music and this mirror and his clothes, the phone rings. Anyone see why I see a parallel between the ringing telephone and this scene in Book 4 of Paradise Lost? Yes.
Isn't it kind of Adam who wakes him up from a beautiful dream?
Yes, or the voice of God or the voice of an angel. It's a male voice that wakes her, that draws her away from, that draws Eve away. A male voice draws Eve away from her obsession, her engagement with that image of herself in the pool. Just as the phone ringing, and it turns out to be her boyfriend or her husband, I would submit, is symbolically the male patriarchal society asserting its control even over her moment of pleasure playing dress up in the privacy of her bedroom. And what does she say? "Oh, honey, I was just thinking of you." You say, "Hey, I was just dressing up in your clothes. I was just cross-dressing, you know. I'm thinking about transitioning." Oh, you didn't think of that? I don't know. This commercial, by the way, ran for 12 or 15 years, almost always on Monday Night Football, all through the 1990s. Apparently, it was a really successful way to sell Brut cologne to Monday Night Football fans. Now, is that because Monday Night Football fans, as a group, maybe deep down, have some kind of homoerotic desire, maybe they're not even in touch with, and like to see someone dressing up in men's clothes and thereby wanting to go buy Brut? Probably they wouldn't want to own it if that's true. They might not be aware of it if it's true. But it might be encoded deeply into the gender roles that we have inherited or we learn in a patriarchal society, where it's not enough to demarcate two different sexes, but one sex must be subordinated to the other. And then, as if that's not enough, the subordinated sex is even more attractive if the female enacts a desire to be male, or desire to be owned by male, or a desire to identify with the masculine. So it gets pretty deep, and I'm kind of deep into some psychoanalytic territory here, and it's all open for debate and for discussion. But there's just so many recurring instances of this kind of representation of gender roles and desire and the construction of identity and the two-sided either-or representation of human identity and subjectivity in a patriarchal society and in a hierarchical society with relations between men and women in this hierarchical structure, going at least back to the Hebrew Bible and on forward through our current moment. Although we've seen some readjustments fairly recently. Anything else or any other thoughts? Anyone see something here that I've left out?
With that, I'll conclude this webcast.
But, as always, if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to send me an email.